Finally, I think I'm getting to speak to you guys. I've done writing, but I think this would be a good first step into this and to unity and a sense of unity, like my title says. I think we all on the left owe you guys on the right an apology. And I'm not even going to criticize you guys because I think it's actually all of our fault that we're here. But I just want to start off saying, you guys remember the gels and the deep cleanings? First, I have to say, no one said my bad when the articles came out and the chances of getting COVID through, surfaces was 1 in 10,000 or some ridiculous number. And I think we need to say sorry. Sorry to all those business owners and people who spent a lot of money they're not going to get back and lost a lot of clients that they're not going to get back on something that made no sense and we should have thought about sooner. Second thing, I know you guys have had trouble articulating, is a death a death? No, of course it's not. And I'm sorry for, the left and their elites not telling you guys something that we've known for 40 years. We talk about life years lost because a woman who lost her life at 79 and had a life expectancy, of a woman in the United States only lost 2.4 years. We're talking about 2.4 years of life years lost versus a 2-year-old female child lost 79 that's 79 years of life years wiped off. And so the measure of which, money should be spent has been debated, but it's been pretty much accepted to be GDP per capita, around maybe 40,000 per life year loss. So you should definitely be gauging your um, your expenditures, which people have been doing and private companies have been doing to calculate costs of medicines for a long time. And it's really logical that it's not the same spending $5 million to save someone who only has 6 months to live versus 50,000. There is somewhere where there's going to be a debate, but we're way past that. And we never even had it. And we tried to make you guys feel like you were idiots just saying that grandmother dying is not the same as a 2-year-old dying. And it's definitely not. Um, I also want to apologize for the fact that, if you take into account how many life years were lost in COVID, it was about 20 million. And there were 100 million people that died during 1918, and the left never mentions that that was a world where there was 1.5 billion people. And so is it fair to talk about, my devastating deaths of 1,000 people in my island of 100,000 versus my country of 100 million? No, I kind of think you need to put that into perspective. So in today's losses, if it were today's population, that percentage of loss would have been about 420 billion people. And because the average age is 27 years, and the average age of the person who died, it wiped about 815 billion years off of a planet that had a fifth of the population of today. I think that's a lot to think about when we're. So it was actually, if you do the calculations, COVID was about 2 to 4 times more deadlier than a flu, and the 1918 pandemic was about 700 times. So who are the idiots? And that debate, left never talks about that. And I want to apologize for left media because I think they just ran this hysteria, until the last, and they're still doing it because, another thing, you remember the daily death tolls? What happened to the daily death tolls? Yeah, when those didn't get scary enough, it was case explosions. And I want to tell you guys as a doctor, case is not equivalent. Number one, a positive swab is not equivalent to a case, which is not equivalent to disease. There's 15% of the population that's streptococcal colonized in their throat. They'd be positive. They're not sick. Those things needed to be contextualized. What is a case when you're vaccinated and it really is like the common cold, which coronavirus is the cause of. Or talking about mutations Remember Delta? Now we're in Omicron. What's it going to be next? And no one ever explaining to people that's how viruses live. They act, viruses have there are so many different levels that they can mutate that it's complex to even describe the rates of mutation. The 1918 flu pandemic mutates every year, and vaccine is way less efficient. And if we had the same left back then, we'd still be wearing masks and closing stuff down 100 years later. Viruses mutate. That's not what they do. It's not how they become pandemics. And the thing is that it's a trade-off. Most viruses make a lot of mutations that are not viable, even within the same host. And they don't want to become too mortal because then they don't spread. So it's usually this. They would have you say 1 in 100 years. I think that's also very misleading because if you look at the virus, like the 1918 flu, that would have killed the equivalent of 400 billion people today. And I just pick the go overall human death rate at 1%. Consider that a devastating virus. Coronavirus doesn't even make the cut. In the last 2,000 years, there have been two bubonic plagues in 1918. So we're still probably maybe 400 years away from the next real devastating or pandemic of that kind, if it ever comes again. And if we don't stop this nonsense telling me to shut up about mutations and cases, we'll be wearing masks and shutting stuff down for the next 400 years. But, keep it real. That's science. Because the thing we always should have been asked or been asking is, does the mutation of a virus that wasn't very likely, it actually didn't have really good cards to win that lottery. It's like it won lottery in BP in Baltimore, and now everyone's camping out there waiting for the next ticket to fall there, and that's not how it works. What do these mutations mean that it's going to happen again? That's a very complicated thing to answer, or how to answer. But the answer is no. No, it doesn't. The 1918 flu was what it was. It's mutated plenty of times. It has not become another. And that's why vaccination is the only prophylactic measure you should take in public health. The only. And then preparedness. And this is the other thing. We've been in this pandemic so long, we should be experts at throwing up hospitals to meet capacity. Before there were bureaucratic and dumb excuses, and I'm apologizing for that. Whatever happened to the ship that had 1,000 capacity to only have like 20 patients in it? Why did it really, I don't want to get into healthcare system stuff and high capacity, but if there are so few ICU beds, why can't we throw up a hospital? Those are the things that should have been happening aren't happening. I also want to apologize to the left for being selfish assholes because the number of people who have died under. No, actually, first I'm sorry. I'm gonna talk about something. This needs to be talked about. How do we end up here? Media hysteria. The media is changing narrative. If we're not talking about something, if we're not talking about deaths, we're talking about cases. We're talking about ICU beds, and we're not doing anything to, like what would happened in New York, and who knows even why that, And then the last thing was the anecdote factor, and this is important for all. We are all doing this wrong. And those flus and 1918 pandemic, the age of death was traumatic. It was very predictable. I think how you didn't help us get out of this is you guys love talking about anecdotes that don't matter. If this is a curve, we should not be using the extremes ever. Like the anecdotes should support the trend. The trend is that the average age of death is over 50 for COVID, and that the amount of people who have died under 17 in the United States is 690 something, which happens to be the average age in Africa. And so I don't know what idiot ever thought that COVID was gonna be a big thing in the third world. or it would where countries have 2% of their populations over 65, like that was going to be a cost benefit thing for them. We are responsible for having killed people there. But the last thing is, if there was that very unlikely, what could happen, person who's 30 years old and could die with no previous health problems from COVID. I think the honesty is that everyone's like, well, it might happen once. It might be a lottery ticket, but I don't want it to be mine. And that's also not the way things work. We would be sitting, we're never going to leave our houses. That is not, it's still not likely to happen. And in the 19 pandemic, with a population of 1/5 of today's world population, you had thousands of kids dying a day. And it's so rare that you can put Bobby on the news and interview his family. And the left wing does that and is downright criminal, to be honest, or pretending like COVID is a synonym of a grave disease when it's not if you're vaccinated. Number one, and if you're not vaccinated, are you this bubbling pot for a new, not any more than a chicken, a bird, or a pig, which are the reservoirs for the flu pandemic. And to me, it's like if we were like we've done like two things. Say, kids, build a fortress around that rock because it got hit by lightning 3 years ago, and you never know. That's been as smart as our logic. And then the other is, as soon as we get rid of those darn unvaccinated, we're going after the pigs and the birds and the frogs or whatever else we can find. No. Like, once the vaccination turned COVID into a cold, which it always was, this pandemic should have been over, and there should have been a lot of apologies given. And not only that, the last thing I want to say is that the very few people have died in Africa, while 14 million and over 700 million life years were wiped off of the planet due to, and I can send you guys the article, and I made sure of this, poverty, death attributed to COVID-induced poverty that would not have been produced in its absence. And so we can say without a doubt that anti-COVID measures are killing way more people than COVID measures are. And it's always been that way. And this nonsense needs to stop. It's unfortunate, that the left, who thinks they know so much, has been so stupid. All of a sudden, they thought they're all doctors. And I'm going to be honest, I think since American doctors don't think about health in a public way, which is, if you want to spend $5 million to save your grandmother 6 more months, I'll just let you. Maybe that's the reason. I don't know. But this has been a disaster, and there's no doubt in my mind that in hundreds of years they're going to be writing books about how ridiculous and harmful this pandemic, because it doesn't qualify as a devastating pandemic, has been. And the last thing is that the trend you see over the years is that the pandemics were worse because they had less uh, knowledge of health, which makes this, which should make our fear even less. It was improvements in health infrastructure that made pandemics that killed 60% of the world's population less likely. Like, is another mutation more likely to recreate a bubonic plague? No, it's less. It's even less likely. That's probably likely never going to happen again. But it could. That's why we should be prepared, not perpetually preventing. Thanks for listening.